So this is chapter 11 called Planning and Implementing the Intervention, and it's from our macro social work book for our macro social work class. So I'm going to be talking about, let me hit plex, the learning outcomes of this chapter, which are define and explain the flow and sequencing of steps in the logic model, write goals, objectives, and an action plan for a macro level intervention project. So the first slide talks about logic model. So the purpose of the logic model was to streamline the cumbersome process of evaluating federally funded social programs that prior to this time would take many months. This model shifts the emphasis to evaluating program outcomes in the context of social work macro practice. Application of the logic model requires taking the data collected and compiled at this point and organizing them in a way that makes three things clear. And the book says that the three things are what resources will be used when we are talking about intervention models, in what manner or process will they be used, and also the specific outcomes that will be achieved once we put it into place. So the next slide was a term from the book about the Government Performance and Results Act, or the GPRA. So the GPRA altered how the federal government monitored and evaluated its grants and contracts. It did so by federal government monitored and evaluated its grants and contracts. It did so by focusing less on how funds are spent and more on whether stated outcomes are achieved, such as reduction of unemployment or even the increases in graduation rates. So now, programs that receive federal funds are required to identify performance and outcome measures in their initial proposal for federal funding. And then also the book stated they are paid only for achievement of results, not simply activities that are put into place, and they also must certify their performance and results in writing. So the first task that they mentioned in the book for planning and implementing the intervention was to revisit the working hypothesis, which is what we talked about in chapter 9, I believe. So we're going to look back on our working hypothesis and say, does the working hypothesis need any adjustments? And if so, what adjustments? And as this process unfolds, we can revisit our working hypothesis and see if we need to rethink things through. So that's the first task. The second task is to set a goal for the intervention. So we set goals every day for ourselves, what needs to be achieved and what is successful or not. So the main question here is, what is the overall purpose that is expected if the intervention is successful? And we are writing goals and outcomes objectives only for the purpose, identifying what we hope to achieve, and also to provide a framework for monitoring and evaluation. The third task is write outcome and process objectives. So this is setting goals and objectives require translating concepts and ideas from the abstract phases of the logic model into concrete terms. The method of planning simplifies a potentially complex understanding by breaking it up into manageable parts. Objectives serve as an elaboration of goals. They spell out the details of the planned intervention in measurable terms, which includes our expected outcomes of the problem and the process needed to achieve them. And then we'll talk about process objectives later in the slides. Establish a time frame for the outcome objective. So we talked about duration and all those terms in the last chapter. So we're going to talk about the time frame for objective outcome. So is it possible to establish a day, month, and year when results should be evident? Is our main question here. At what point in the future is it reasonable to expect to see measurable results from the intervention? And then it gave us the definition of a time frame, which should be stated in terms of months, day, and year, by which results will be achieved. So we can have a problem occur, and in order to come up with a time frame, we have to say, okay, how long is it going to take us to evaluate this problem and come up with a result for it? Will it take a month? Will it take a week? Will it take a year? And because this information will be later be needed for monitoring purposes. The time frame for an outcome objective should not exceed 1 year, as funding and sponsoring sources usually expect at least annual reporting on progress and then later on results. So defining the target problem. So when it comes to coming up with the problem and seeing, or the target population, so these are the people who are strongly affected by the problem. So who or what group will experience a quality of life change as a result of the intervention? So if we come up with an intervention for the problem, who in the population is going to be strongly affected by it? So the target population involves specific individuals, groups, and communities for whom the change effort is being made. And then specify a result or outcome. So what benefits or quality of life changes are expected for the target population from this intervention? So what exactly results are we going to get from this intervention? And the exact phrasing of an outcome is determined by the goal of the program or project. So then it talked about define a criterion for measuring success. So how will the result as stated in the objective be measured? Are there observable criteria readily available for measurement, or will criteria need to be designed? And the final part of an objective is a criterion to be used in determining whether the objective has been achieved. And then it talked about how objectives must be precise and measurable, yet sometimes the result to be achieved seems vague and elusive. So this is now going to bring up process objectives, which is what I talked about earlier. So process objectives are each outcome objective is followed by a number of process objectives designed to spell out how outcome objectives will be achieved. So process objectives designed to spell out how the outcome objective will be achieved, and then process objectives should identify the major components of a planned intervention and not the specific details like the other one. So now we're going to talk about establishing a time frame for the process objective now. So this raises the question, when will the actions specified in this objective begin and end? So time frames are specified in the same way for both the outcome, which we talked about earlier, and the process objectives. So ideally, target dates or milestones are established in terms of specific dates, day, and month in the year. So same as before, and timeframes for process objectives must, of course, synchronized for the related outcome objective. So now we're going to talk about defining the target for process objectives. So what individuals, groups, or products will be the focus of this objective? And that's the main question here for this. And process objectives break down the change effort into a series of tasks. This focus is on what steps need to be taken in order to achieve the outcome objective. The steps may focus on an individual or a certain group of people. So now, what result will provide evidence that the objective has been achieved? So when it comes to results of the intervention, results in process objectives involve completion of a service or intervention process. So what intervention process we came up with and if it's going to be completed or not. And this must be stated in a way that is concrete and observable. If the process involves services to people, the result might be something like completion of a course, completion of at least 6 counseling sessions, or attendance at no less than 3 job training sessions. If the process involves changing an organization or community, the result might be described as a completed report, a new strategic plan, or a new data collection form. So now we're going to talk about use for documentation purposes. So what observable or measurable factors can be used to determine whether the process objective has been achieved? So what process objectives focus on the completion of something? So this might involve participants completing a portion of the service process, such as the training sessions we talked about before, counseling sessions. Or it might be the creation of products, such as policy or training manuals. So coming up with different policies for the intervention or a training manual. So many different criteria can be used to document the result of a process objective. The focus in writing process objectives is on determining if a particular step toward an outcome has been achieved and documenting that certain fact. So task 4 is about list activities for process objectives. So the final step when it comes to your intervention plan and how we're going to change our problem is to include activities. So activities represent the highest level of detail when it comes to a plan. So each activity represents something that someone does that, when completed, will advance the change effort toward achievement of a process objective. Activities should specify the work to be done, the person responsible, and the time frame, which we discussed earlier. So, format activities for easy monitoring. So the questions raised here are: what activities or tasks must be successfully completed in order to achieve the process objective? When should each activity begin and end? Who should be assigned responsibility for completion of the activity? And activities should be organized in ways that promote orderly, systematic implementation, such as an approach might lead to organizing by individuals, by types of tasks, or by the certain sequences of activities or tasks that are monitored and distributed. So when it comes to the activities, the book talked about I think it's pronounced the Gantt chart, Gantt. The Gantt chart is a table in which each row represents an activity and each column indicates a pan of time over which activity is to be completed. So in our book, there was a really good chart and picture of the chart, but I couldn't get it on the slides. I tried to Google search one as well, but I didn't really get any good results or good photos. So I just tried to make it and see what it looks like on here. So I put so it would be lined up like this. It would be like activity number, activity, the person responsible, and then the months or how long it takes. So these can show what activity is being presented, who's responsible for it, and how long it will take to complete. So an additional columns can also be used before or after a particular activity and may be added to identify the activity number and the person responsible as well. And then finally, task 5 is initiate action plan. So a common oversight in planning for organizational community change is leaving out of the planning process those who ultimately are responsible for implementation of the program. In any change effort, it is common to feel that the standard approaches that have been used have not been effective in getting the job done. So something new needs to be tried. So if nothing is getting done and the plan isn't working or intervention isn't working, then there needs to be a new plan in place. Putting a certain plan into action usually requires completion of a number of tasks prior to involving clients, consumers, and participants, just so we can see how it works first. And then in order for the action to take place, the intervention needs to also be formalized. So it needs to be formalized and it needs to make sense. And clients, consumers, and participants need to make sure that it makes sense to them before a certain action can take place. Manage logistics. What facilities, equipment, record keeping, and other resources, including staff and volunteers, will need to be made available prior to implementation. So this is important because we need to think about resources included to make this change. We need to think about the staff involved and the volunteers who are all coming together to help make the change happen. What steps or phases need to be implemented in what order in order to maximize efficiency? The planned change will likely involve some combination of existing staff and volunteers, new services, new staff, and perhaps even new clients, consumers, or participants. If new personnel are to be involved, appropriate space and equipment will have to be arranged. If existing staff and volunteers are used, decisions need to be made then again about sharing of space and equipment between the old and new programs. So then when it comes to your participants, so selecting and training participants, so this raises the question of who will have overall leadership and management responsibilities for the intervention. So how are we going to select and train certain people to have certain responsibilities and certain tasks to complete the intervention? Will existing or new staff and or volunteers be used in the intervention? What preparations need to be made to bring new participants on board? What type of orientation and training will be needed? And because these individuals will be crucial to the success of the intervention, careful screening will be required using standards established in job descriptions for these positions. So it would just be like if you were applying for any other job. So once the action plan is put in place, ongoing monitoring ensures that the plan will be implemented as designed, and the evaluation ensures that there will be a periodic assessments and results will then be achieved. So that pretty much covered everything from chapter 11 on planning and implementing the intervention. So we defined and explained the flow of sequencing and steps of the logic model. So each task, we went through each task and discussed those. How to write goals, objectives, and action plan for a macro level project, which we did go over. And then my final thoughts on this chapter were there was a lot that goes into resolving conflict and problems. We must use all these techniques, tactics, and strategies in order to have a successful intervention and later a future successful outcome. So I hope this was helpful. And then, again, this is from our macro social workbook on chapter 11. And that pretty much wraps it up. So again, I hope this was helpful.